This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hello, friends. Steve here with a quick announcement about today's episode. This episode is a part of a series that Mustache Chris and I did on the film Iceman. In this episode, we will get into some of the background and the history and the context behind the Iceman and other related characters in this fascinating story. The Iceman, of course, was the serial killer / mob hitman who developed and created an identity that may or may not have been rooted in fact. We really hope you enjoy these episodes, and then which will culminate in the discussion on the film. Before we get on with the show, one thing that you can do that will really help us out is if you can hit the like and subscribe button to this episode if you are listening on YouTube. Or if you're not listening on YouTube, go and like and subscribe to the podcast there. We really hope you enjoy these episodes. We'd love to hear your feedback down in the comments. Let us know what you think, and let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about Paul Castellano, because Paul Castellano, he came up in our last episode about the Iceman. To me, he seemed like the most unlikeliest of mafia guys, because he had a huge legitimate business in meat packing. His business was in selling meat and chicken, and he made tons and tons of money. If I'm not mistaken, both of his sons were involved in the business, and they were completely legit. And I don't understand why someone like Paul Castellano would want to be involved in this really dirty, nasty underworld element of the mafia, when he could have just been involved completely in the white collar part of the mafia, which in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, sure, if you were in labor unions or if you were in something like meat packing, yeah, you were connected to the mafia, but you didn't have to be in the nitty gritty of being around people like Roy DeMeo in the Westies and the really gritty, nasty part of the mafia and the organized crime.
No, I think it's because he just kind of grew up with it and then kind of got pulled into it. And because he was such a good earner, I mean, it would make kind of sense that you would want that guy to be the head of the family, because nobody knew how to like make as much money as Paul and do it legitimately for the most part and not attract like police attention. But I don't like Paul wasn't really cut out for the job too. Like, I don't think he really understood like stuff that was coming down the pipe in terms of like RICO and like wiretapping, because he would have all the guys like show up at I believe it was like the Veterans Club that they called every 2 weeks, every week, to sit down and talk about, what was going on in the Gambino family. And the cops are just kind of sitting there laughing at them. And it's like, well, I mean, really? They're all going to show up at the same time? We're just going to stand out here, take pictures, and and his own house was wiretapped at one point. He just it seemed like probably like a good idea in theory. This guy's a great earner and he seems to keep his nose pretty clean. Like, who better to run the family? But in practice, it didn't really work out all that well. And I mean, he was so like white collar too that he really kind of pissed off the guys that were, like the street guys. And if you're going to be the head of a mafia family, you have to be able to strike a balance between the two, where the street guys are happy because you do need them. At the end of the day, the mafia is kind of built on muscle. If you don't have that, the threat of violence, if the rest of it doesn't really work all that well. I mean, especially in like labor unions and like the construction business. And even Paul's chicken and poultry business was built on kind of loan sharking, where, he was successful at it. And then he would lend out loans to like other, butcher shops and what have you. And then they obviously wouldn't be able to pay. And then he would just take like 25 or 50% of their business. And that's kind of how it grew. That doesn't work if you don't really have the guys like Roy DeMeo showing up at, Joe Schmo's butcher house saying, this is how it's going to go down. And if it doesn't go down in the next couple of days like this, we're going to take care of business. If they're not afraid that these guys are going to take care of business, the whole thing doesn't really work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think definitely. And somebody like Paul, he was perfect as the boss in that he had this really good knowledge of the white collar part. But at that point in the Gambino family, the Gambino family was really the mafia in New York City. There were still the five families. And if we go a little bit further, the DeCavalcantis in New Jersey, right next door. But it was really the Gambinos were the game. They were the biggest family, and they were divided between the Manhattan faction under Neil Della Croce and Nino Gaggi in the Brooklyn faction. It was a family that was really split between these two regional factions, plus the white collar faction and the more blue collar faction. So it was a very tough, or it was a huge umbrella, you might say, and it was maybe too big for its own good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different theories about like if Neil Della Croce had been made boss instead of Paul Castellano, like how history would have been different, like just John Gotti come around, and it's interesting, but yeah, like Paul just wasn't the guy for the job, in my opinion. You can't look down on the street guys, because without them, the rest of it just doesn't work. And the intimidation of somebody like Roy DeMeo is like essential to the mafia. If that doesn't, you got to treat those guys fairly, because they're just as important as the guys, doing, running the concrete business, which is pretty much the mob ran the entire concrete business. It's crazy to think that in New York, if you poured any concrete, that was the mob's concrete. You're paying the mob one way or another.
Now, the other thing, so we have this really that Paul Castellano is like one of those people with the plates trying to like spin them on sticks and keep this whole thing of the Gambino crime family going. Then you have, if we zoom in on on Roy DeMeo, looking at his personal life, he was somebody who, for the most part, lived two separate lives. That he didn't live in Brooklyn. He lived in the suburbs. He lived a completely normal suburban lifestyle at the same time of being a brutal street criminal in New York City.
He would do like fireworks shows for house parties, soccer practice, and for, every in-house with the mob, the peddling the pornography and all that stuff. And he tried to, like, his family life was completely separate, not want any of the stuff kind of really involved in all the craziness. How do you think it seemed that Roy was able to hold those two lives together for a long time, but then it really did start breaking down for him. Yeah, well, the thing that kind of starts it is Chris Rosenberg. Should we start talking about that?
Yeah,
that's kind of where it kind of all starts falling apart.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah, so Chris Rosenberg, who we had mentioned earlier, was kind of like a son almost to Roy DeMeo. You kind of viewed him as like a son or a little brother. Comes up with this harebrained idea that he was going to do a massive coke dealer with some Colombians that were living in Florida. Not Colombians, Cubans that were in Florida at the time. And Chris comes up with this great idea. It's like, well, I'm going to do the deal and I'm going to show up, but I'm going to take the coke and I'm also going to take the money. So how is Chris going to do this? Oh, he's just going to kill them. And as opposed to like introducing himself as like Chris Rosenberg, which is who he is. He introduced himself as Chris DeMeo, and where it gets, I believe he was like the guys who were he ended up killing were like cousins to some, I think it was El Negro, who was some Cuban, some big time like Cuban drug lord, and they basically say that the only form that the only way that this is going to go away is if Chris Rosenberg is killed and it's made publicly. So Nino Gaggi goes to Roy DeMeo. It's like, I understand that, how much Chris means to you, but he like really messed up. And if we don't do anything about this quickly, we could have a full on, war between the Gambino family and a Cuban drug cartel. And to be quite honest with you, the Gambinos are really powerful, but I don't really know if they could have taken on a drug cartel, which, anybody's like looked into narcos. There's the mafia, and then like the narcos are a whole another level above the mafia in terms of just, power and influence. Roy, for obvious reasons, is apprehensive. He really doesn't want to do this, and this kind of shows a different kind of side to Roy, where a lot of the stuff you read about Roy, you get the impression that he's just this like cold-blooded, ruthless killer, and he definitely was that. But this to me shows, I think it was like 2 weeks or a couple of weeks he was holding off trying to killing Chris because he really didn't want to do this. And Roy, in the meantime, he's like getting paranoid, and there was a kid hanging out in front of his house. Can't remember his name right now, but he looked Cuban, and Roy DeMeo thought it was a Cuban hitman. So, he chases him down for a couple of blocks and catches up to him and basically shoots him dead, right in the middle of the street, middle of the day. Turns out that the kid was just selling vacuums, and Nino gets word of this and freaks out and says, like, okay, that's enough. Like, you take care of Chris right now, or you're done yourself. We'll take care of you. And so they get Chris to go back to the Gemini Lounge, which they had done many, many times. I'm surprised that Chris, knowing the circumstances, would agree to go to the Gemini Lounge, but he does. And Roy shoots them, and from the information that we have, he shoots them once and in the head, but Chris didn't die. I guess he didn't get a clean enough shot, and he's up on one knee. Roy can't finish the job, and I believe in the job for Roy. But Roy's son talks about this period in Roy's life, and how it really messed him up. Like when he shot that Cuban kid, he was, I believe, didn't leave his room for a couple of days. It really affected him. And then on top of, with Chris, it really affected him too. And it shows that he wasn't like a psychopath. He actually did feel that he actually did care about people and deeply. And unlike, say, like somebody like a Ted Bundy, who was a sociopath and didn't really have any empathy for anybody, clearly Roy did. He was just able to compartmentalize the what he was doing with the murdering, because for the most part, the guys that he was killing were going to rat on him and his crew and, ruin his family's life. And for the most part, the guys who were going to be ratting weren't like exactly good guys either. They probably would have done the same thing to Roy if the roles were reversed. I mean, I can see in a way how you would justify to yourself that like these murders are okay because they, because of the situation I just laid out. But Chris, that's my best friend. And this kid, he had nothing to do with it. I was just being paranoid, and I killed an innocent person for no reason.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. That's the big thing with Roy, and I think you have to try and understand Roy. I think even though it's hard to, and it's been really hard for me to wrap my mind around. Roy is like somebody in the military who they kill the enemy. I think that for Roy, he took a lot of glee in it and a black humor, but I think it was black humor in a lot of ways to cover up for how insane it was, how much killing they were doing and the way they were killing people. But like you said, that Roy really was upset that he had to kill his best friend for a good chunk of his life, and a person who he mentored in Chris Rosenberg, and that inadvertently killing that kid who was selling the vacuums. That really wasn't Roy. Roy was a killer, but he wasn't a serial killer. I think that's really the difference.
Yeah, it's like the military is a really good comparison. That's kind of how I view it. Is Roy saw himself as a soldier in the Gambino family, and he excelled at doing this type of dirty work, and he viewed it as no different than, say, like a soldier going into battle and having to kill the enemy.
Let's shift gears a bit to the biggest score really that Roy had in his whole career. And it was this whole thing about stealing cars in New York, cleaning them up, you might say, and then shipping them over to Kuwait. It was really the score that made him a lot of money. And if it had really come to full fruition, would have probably made him one of the biggest gangsters of all times.
Yeah, it's called it's referred like Empire Boulevard, and they had this whole elaborate system in terms of stealing these cars, where they had it down to such a science where his Kuwaiti buyers would say, we want Caddy, 72 Caddy red with these types of rims. And Roy had a whole army of kids basically that were these cars, and they had a system where he basically had like an on-demand car stealing service where people would right down to the color of the paint, the type, mileage, the whole 9 yards. And yeah, they would bring them back to the Empire Boulevard, and they would change the VIN number and stuff so that the car wasn't traceable. And I'm trying to remember the amount of cars that were stolen in a year, but it is astronomical, and there was just nothing being done about it. I mean, at the time, the police force in general was understaffed, but roundabout way, the chubby kid from school who was like a butcher apprentice and was always known for these blue collar type crimes has become an international criminal, because that's basically what it is he's committing international crime, trading stolen cars from, New York and shipping them out to Kuwait. It's mind boggling that it got this big.
The thing that, because I was kind of going into this with the modern mindset on how hard it is to really steal a car and resell it in the US with VIN plates, and each car has a unique identifier called a vehicle identification number, a VIN. And if I'm not mistaken, this is kind of your business. The VIN number is all over everything, if I'm not mistaken. It's really hard to take a car and just resell it, because then you can't get it registered. You can't do anything with it because of this VIN number.
Yeah, that's why a lot of the times, the cars they would end up stealing they would sell cars whole. Sometimes they'd sell them to used shady or used car lots and what have you, and they would buy it for cheap. But for the most part, you would steal the car, and it goes to what we call in the business kind of, I'm not in the chop shop business, but we call them chop shops. And they would steal a car and they chop the car up. So they take all the parts out of all the valuable parts off the car and then sell the parts. And then those become untraceable for the most part. And then they would just get rid of the car, no crime. And this thing took it to a whole nother level, though, because they were selling entire cars, and I assume parts too, but entire cars to these Kuwaiti businessmen. And I guess at the time that they did have VIN numbers on the cars, Roy was able to come up with new VIN numbers, and he would double check with his contacts in the police department to, make sure that this didn't accidentally just like duplicate a VIN number or what have you. And then that would like trigger off like if this car had ever got pulled over or what have you. Cause he had a whole sophisticated business too, in terms of like, police on the payroll basically, because none of this would work unless the police were turning a blind eye to a lot of it.
And he was really kind of threading the needle, because the local, the NYPD cared about the stolen cars, but the federal authorities like Customs, they didn't particularly care, because the paperwork was clean enough for them that they didn't really, it didn't raise any huge alarms to them of these cars. And a lot of them had really, they were getting sloppy with the VIN plates, and they were getting sloppy with a lot of elements with it, but it didn't really matter because the Kuwaitis didn't care. They were just getting flooded with extremely cheap cars, and Roy was making a fortune off of it. I think they were saying that just when they were getting ramped up, they were stealing 4 to 5 cars a night, every night of the week for weeks and weeks and weeks. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of cars. They had to expand their enterprise from being able to process 4 cars at a time to 20 cars at a time. And that was at a time when it was a lot easier to steal cars than it was today. So it was just like boom, 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 boom. Cars were just vaporizing off the street.
Yeah. Well, it goes to show you too that like the cops he had to have enough of the police force paid off the police force with nothing to really be done about for as long as this was going on. You'd imagine, like, just say for 20 cars a day are getting stolen in New York, 20 cars, to the point where they, like I pointed out, they had like an on-demand service where you could just kind of go to Roy and be like, I want a red caddy. Oh yeah, no problem. I get it for you tomorrow. And he just sends out like some kids to go steal the car from, because they would use kids, because for the most part, nothing would really happen to them. They just get sent home. Like they wouldn't throw them in, like, hey, kids, don't, steal a car again. For the most part, that's what they would do.
And for the most part, you could teach a kid how to steal those cars. A kid could steal one of those cars in minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, easily. And then there's like, you don't have to worry about a lot of the other stuff of like an adult was caught stealing the car. They'll be like, who are you stealing the car for? Most people are stupid. They'll start blabbing.
What really was the cause of Roy's fall? Because Roy eventually does it. Everything crumbles underneath him. His whole foundations. What happens to Roy?
It's crazy as it sounds. You think once Roy was made a made guy, he would just kind of slow down a bit. It's like, okay, I'm good. But no, apparently the exact opposite happened. He ramped up the killing and he took more contracts, and like to the point he was like doing like discounts, and it's crazy. The figure you would slow down, and you've made it. You're not gonna Roy wasn't gonna get any higher than that. He was a made guy. He wasn't gonna be a capo. He was never gonna be a head of a family. That was never gonna happen. He figured, I've reached the pinnacle of everything I worked for. But no, that's not what happened at all. But like the one particular situation that happened that kind of like accelerated his downfall was, there was James Eppolito and James Eppolito Jr., right? Am I saying that I'm remembering this correctly? And yes, they're actually related to that famous mafia cop. Yeah. It's a really those guys, it's fascinating story. They go to Paul Castellano saying that Roy and Nino are dealing drugs, and officially the ruling in the Gambino family, it was different from family to family, but in the Gambino family, Paul Castellano had like a 0 tolerance policy for dealing drugs. This is what he would say, right? And it was like death penalty for anybody caught dealing drugs. Now people say like, oh, wasn't that like moral and virtuous for the mafia family to be like, oh, we're not going to be dealing drugs? It wasn't like anything to do with morals. It was guys would get caught dealing drugs, and the charges for dealing drugs were really high. So like guy dealing just a bit of heroin or a bit of coke would be looking at 20 years in prison. Most people don't have enough willpower to not talk when they're looking at 20 years in prison. They're probably going to talk, and it causes so people talk, but then if you're having to worry about people talking because they got busted for drugs, you're going to have to take care of them. You take care of them yourself, and it just leads to all kind of problems. It's just in the long run, there's a ton of money to be made in drugs, but Paul and certain mafia guys, it's not worth all the extra trouble. Like we're making tons of money doing our loan sharking and stealing cars and our labor unions and construction rackets, and we don't need that type of money. But Paul was a hypocrite. He knew that Roy and Nino were dealing drugs, and he took the money, right? Paul goes to Nino and says, well, these Ippolito guys have came to me saying that you were doing this. He goes and basically gave Roy and Nino the go ahead, just take care of it as you want. And so Roy and Nino they find out where these guys are. I believe it was in a parking garage or what have you, and they go and kill them. But there happened to be an eyewitness nearby that saw them do it, and they waved. I guess she waved a cop that was nearby, and the cop came down, and Nino and Roy get into a gunfight with the cop. Nino gets hit. He ends up in the neck. He gets arrested. Roy ends up getting away. But this is where one of the more infamous Roy DeMeo stories. And it was can you explain this harebrained scheme that they had? Because they end up taking the bullet out of Nino's neck and try to put a different bullet in his neck.
Oh, it was so dumb, but if it worked, it would have been genius. I think I didn't completely understand what they were trying to do, because I don't think they really understood what they were trying to do, but they wanted it. They wanted it to make it look like Nino had been shot earlier, I think, to give him a defense that it was a self-defense or something. It was a really because I think you have to look at it that juries and lawyers and that the whole criminal thing, you're just trying to prove some tiny doubt in one juror's mind that maybe it didn't happen the way the prosecution said it. But it was just, I think that it was, to me, that was so emblematic of Nino. It's Nino, let's come up with this harebrained idea and throw it up in the air and let's see if it takes off or not.
Yeah. What ends up happening is Nino ends up going to jail for, I believe it was 5 to 15 years. Probably would have got more, but there was jury tampering involved, and I mean the whole situation is just not good. Roy killed that innocent kid, and then now on top of this, they're getting into shootouts with cops and being really sloppy about. That was the thing with the Ippolito murders, is just it doesn't seem like Roy. I don't know, it's almost like hubris. He's going to a parking lot, out in the open. It just doesn't, Roy from a couple years ago probably would have came up with a more intelligent way of going about this and not getting caught. But I think it was just kind of hubris, and maybe he was just getting tired of the whole lifestyle, I think, because it is really sloppy, and it doesn't seem, I don't know, like I pointed out, a couple of years ago, Roy wouldn't be doing this, but the whole situation isn't good. Your capo's in jail. It puts a huge red light on your light on all the illegal stuff that you're up to, and just puts a lot of heat on the Gambino family, because I mean, getting into shootouts with your inter-mafia guys is one thing, but getting into shootouts with cops,
it's just so much heat. It's so unnecessary, and I think that was a major unforced error for them, that whole situation.
Yeah, because they could have just, I mean, okay, whatever, you wanted revenge at these Ippolito guys, you could have just waited. There was no reason you had to take immediate revenge. They could have just waited for a better, literally probably could have waited a couple of years, and then these guys probably would have had their guard down at some point. They just weren't thinking straight. They were thinking impulsively.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I wonder with the mafia at this point, like maybe the smarter people like Paul saw that with dealing drugs, they were dealing with people like with the Colombians and the Cubans and these other groups who were really, really bad hombres, you might call them. They were not anybody to trifle with. And sure, maybe the mafia could have taken them on, but it was so unnecessary to take these on. And it would be just constant warfare when really drugs was just a sideshow for the mafia, the five families.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Like, I mean, some of the cooler heads and some of the, I guess maybe higher IQ people in the mafia kind of looked at the drugs and thought, like, this is just, it's not to mention, like, you end up having guys who end up getting addicted to the drugs and, like if you're dealing drugs in the neighborhood and people are all walking around like zombies in the neighborhood, like the cops start looking into it. It's just, and like the charges that come with, getting busted dealing drugs. It's just, I mean, yes, there's a lot of money that can be made into it. But I mean, if you look at a lot of the big time drug dealers in American history, they kind of were, I don't know, like they would shine really bright for a bit and then it would all come crashing down really quickly, where the mafia was kind of like the opposite, where it was just a slow, gradual buildup.
There was just so much more money to be made too with things like Paul's legitimate businesses. Sure, legitimate businesses that have connections to organized crime get investigated and sometimes there's fines, but there's so much more avenue to obfuscate and move money around on the books and things like that. With drugs, it's so much easier for prosecutors to start sniping people and it just brings down everyone. I have to agree with Paul. Yeah, you're not gonna, well, Paul loved the money though. So Paul, he could have started whacking people to stop it, but he really didn't because he loved taking in all that money. I guess that's the thing, like you were saying, that you can make so much money off of the drugs, but then it brings down all the heat. It brings down heat from the people they're buying the drugs from. It brings down heat from every layer of government. I think that they really did miss something by just staying out of the drugs altogether.
Yeah, that I agree with that. But I mean, the temptation is just, there's so much money to be made. It just seems, the temptation seems to be too much, especially with like the cast of shady characters that is the Italian mafia. But I mean, that's the thing with drugs too, is it doesn't, like, you could like take a low end street dealer and all of a sudden he's, talking about, he's the next Joe Valachi talking about, this is how this whole thing works. And, it's just like a street guy, right? That could be potentially facing 20 years in jail. Like, if Paul was consistent in the sense of, like, he actually did just kill people that were in the Gambino family that were caught dealing drugs, then yeah, but he tried to like have best of both worlds, where he would just pick and choose who he would do that to. Eventually,
Roy's whole world falls apart around him. What's the end of Roy look like?
Well, the heat starts coming down for the car stealing business, but how the whole Ippolito thing went down, Paul Castellano just comes to the conclusion, it's like, yeah, Roy's bringing in a lot of money, but all the other trouble that he's bringing is just not worth it. And he puts out a contract on Roy. And this is what I found pretty interesting, is apparently nobody would really take the contract. They were all just terrified of Roy DeMeo and his crew. Like, apparently John Gotti wouldn't take the job for this reason, because, Roy had a whole like psychotic killer crew with him. And Roy himself was, had a reputation of, well-founded for being pretty insane himself. And yeah, nobody would take the job. And eventually it came down to his own crew was the one that decided they would take the job and do it. And that's exactly what happened. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa are the prime suspects, are the ones who took down Roy DeMeo. But people think that Nino Gaggi, who was out of prison at this time, was there as well. They shot Roy a bunch of times and stuffed him in his trunk of his car, where he was found, I think it was like a couple of days later, frozen to the spare wheel.
Do you think in the end that Roy, because Roy, his career is really very parallel with John Gotti, and this is the time period of the rise of John Gotti. Do you think that Roy was a serious competitor to John Gotti to take over the Gambino crime family?
No, I don't think so. Just because of the way. I mean, it's possible. I mean, Albert Anastasia became like a head of the family himself, right? And he was like Roy DeMeo in the sense of like he enjoyed killing and was pretty insane himself. But I just don't think, I don't know. I just can't see Roy becoming a head of the family. But I mean, he was a great earner and he didn't mind getting his hands dirty. So, I mean, it's possible, but everything that I've read, I don't think many people thought that was a realistic possibility.
And now in our next episode, we're going to tie together Richard Kuklinski and Roy DeMeo. The one thing that sticks with me with Roy DeMeo, and I think that how Richard Kuklinski got drawn into his orbit, is that Roy DeMeo really did surround himself with a varied crew, a diverse crew, you might say. And I think that, not to give away too much of next week, but my thought is that Richard Kuklinski was an admirer of Roy DeMeo from afar.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think Richard, it kind of almost like idol worship Roy DeMeo in a lot of ways. I noticed it when I was reading into the Iceman. I had already known a little bit about Roy DeMeo, but like really getting into like Roy DeMeo's story, it really kind of, and we'll get into this more next week, but it really kind of looks like Richard really wanted to be Roy DeMeo, or admired Roy DeMeo so much that he mixed his story and Roy DeMeo's story together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways it goes even deeper than that. So I think that I know I'm going to really enjoy discussing this story, and I hope people join us next week when we talk about the Iceman movie and how that draws in Richard Kuklinski with the story of Roy DeMeo, because I think people out there are going to see a lot of parallels between their two stories, and I think it's going to be interesting to compare and contrast them and see maybe where some of those similarities come from.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my last word on Roy DeMeo would be John Gotti and tough guys in the Italian mob. Some of the toughest guys in the world or New York at the time had a contract put out on Paul, the boss, put a contract out on Roy, and they looked at Roy and said, "No, I'm not really interested in taking that contract." So that just kind of shows you the reputation that Roy had in in a tough guy world, where he was like the toughest of the tough and the craziest of the craziest. And yeah, I've had a blast, learning about Roy and learning about Richard Kuklinski, and I guess it's going to come to a conclusion next week.